Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the April ERM Toolbox webinar. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. If you've dialed in by phone but haven't logged in by web and you'd like to see the slides that will be shown during the presentation today, please point your web browser to readytalk.com. In the box where it says Participant Join a Meeting, enter the same access code that you used to join the call, 9879821. On the next screen that you see, just scroll down to the bottom of the invitation, enter your name and address and email address, and click the button, and you'll be in the webinar. Please stay aware of the level of background noise in your area, and if it becomes noisy, please put your phone on mute so that your background noise doesn't get transmitted to everybody else on the call. If your phone doesn't have a mute function, you can use the ReadyTalk controls, which are *6 to mute and *7 to unmute. Similarly, if you're called away from the phone, please do not put your phone on hold because that will cause your hold music to be transmitted to everybody else. If you have to step away, you can just hang up, dial back in when you're available, and it will not disrupt the call. We are leaving the phone lines open during the call, so if you have any questions, feel free to ask them as they come up. You can also use the chat box if you'd like. I'll be monitoring that, and we'll relay questions there to our presenter. Also, the raise hand button is available. If you want to do that, I'll keep an eye out for those, and we'll let our presenter know that someone wants to speak. With that, a brief introduction to our presenter today. Philip Van Saun is the Director of Risk, Security, and Resilience for the University of California. Before that, he served for 9 years as Director of Continuity and Emergency Services and as co-chair of the Behavioral Threat Assessment Team at UC San Diego. Philip?
Morning, everyone. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to present to you, and what I'd like to do is go over some of the functions that I have been working with the campuses on and then just open it up to discussion. And some of this crosses over a number of domains, so I understand that we're primarily talking about enterprise risk management, but some of the content talks about crisis management and also on the behavioral threat assessment and violence risk work. So if you do have questions, let me know. What I want to do is provide, again, a brief overview and then just open it up for discussion. And I went to advance here to the next slide, and I see it's not moving. So either I'm doing something wrong or it's locked. There we go. Okay. So 3 things I'll talk about today are risk sensing, which is the process of actively searching for risks in the organization. And this is where I think the idea of crossing into a number of domains and breaking down some barriers or silos is kind of the point. And then taking that information and gaming out a number of different scenarios. Different than tabletop exercises or functional exercises or full-scale exercises that are typically conducted by both risk managers and emergency managers. This is more of an open-ended discussion. So I'll talk about that process. And then just crisis and risk-making decision tools, fast and frugal decision-making, and some of the decision tools that we've talked to the chancellors about in the process of discussing response to demonstrations on campus. The first is, this is just an acknowledgement that the university system and the campus system, it was never set up to do emergency management or risk management. I mean, if we think about the organizational structure, it was set up to provide a rich learning environment. And that's really what we face when we talk about enabling staff to look at risk management as an ownership function for both, especially for faculty members. And so that's one of the areas that I think the enterprise risk management field is left with a challenge. And also kind of a different risk appetite. Traditionally, we've looked at risks that we're willing to accept, and I think we're evaluating those risks now as part of this response to some of the protests and et cetera. So in this process, what we're trying to do is actively search out within the culture of each campus those risks that are considered above what would be acceptable, and try to reduce or mitigate our exposure to negative consequences. I like this quote, so I'll just share that with you. If you're familiar with Dan Kleinman, he wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. And he talks about the cultural conditions generally of financial risk decision making, but they really do apply, I think, to enterprise risk management outside of financial risk. The idea that generally we downplay the risk and also think that we're in perhaps more control of risk than we are. And in most of these cases, the factors that we've seen, and most of you are well aware of this, is that there's an expectation gap. And when I say a gap, my view of this is that the gap is between the expectation of risk managers and emergency services and environment, health, and safety on the campus to be able to prevent the negative consequences from occurring, and downplaying the potential that some of these events we can mitigate the negative consequences, but we might not be able to prevent them. One example is in the violence risk area. So a lot of our work now is to educate both those that are on the behavioral intervention teams, but also the administration, that violence prevention and tools to prevent violence, it's a very challenging area of risk management. We can help people to mitigate the vulnerability, but we may never fully prevent the potential of violence. So we do, in this way, need to understand our stakeholders, and I know many of you are engaged in this process now. It's just an acknowledgement of that. So I want to talk now, bridging from the background to risk sensing. And this is largely based on work done in intelligence collection. So this isn't about the NSA surveilling phones or email or any of those things. That has nothing whatsoever to do with that. It's more an acknowledgement of the process of actively searching for information about risk. And so you see the graphic here. The idea is that we have information that comes in, and we gather that information and try to discern from all of the signals and the noise what it is that could help us to understand a risk embedded in our process. And typically this is done, again, by risk managers, and I think those in environment and health and safety do this through their audits. I'd like to share with you a process, again, that allows for enterprise risk management and risk managers and crisis managers, although we don't have that position identified, and emergency managers, etc., to come together, break down silos, and look at this as a collaborative process where we're all talking about generally actively searching for available intelligence and trying to discern what that means to the risk profile of the campus. So that might be an esoteric explanation, and I'll talk a little bit more about how to make this concrete. So in this process, the first is to think about those threats to the institution. And typically, again, this is already done in many domains, but it's to bring in all of these different risk assessments into one spot where we then game out from a number of different perspectives the potential negative here. One area that traditionally has not been incorporated in this is these expectation gaps. So traditionally we search for risks that are internal, and that could be safety issues or security issues or natural or technological or human-caused events. But what hasn't happened in this process is thinking about the expectations as a risk. In other words, the expectations from perhaps the senior administration, from the local community as to the risk profile of the campus. And I say campus here because really this is focused on coming alongside the campuses and helping them in their process. And obviously, we've seen some cases where there's been an expectation of, for instance, the ability to prevent a violent act, or the well, that's the one that comes to mind. And that failure to meet these expectations then results in kind of a cascading risk. So the idea of doing intelligence collection and this joint risk management process is to take this information and vet it. I've provided just a few guidelines here for how that works, but you're basically looking at what is the source of the information. Are they a source that's provided information before? And this is the analogy and the connection to the intelligence process. And we just essentially give a value to that information. If it's deemed to be trustworthy and credible, then we say that it has a high value, and we're going to take some action based on that. So again, this is a very brief explanation of the risk sensing process, but this is the first stage in collecting the information, going through this screening process. Once we've got the information and assessed the credibility and value, then the next stage is to do some kind of analytical work to clean up the information. And this, which I've placed on the slide, and I see the question from Russ, can we get copies of the slides, and we can make available all the slides at the end. So thanks for asking that question, Russell. The idea is then we use some process of cleaning up the information that we've collected. And again, I mentioned that this is the background of this information, this process is from intelligence collection. This was developed by Richard Schuer, who spent 30 years at CIA and basically went back and looked at the failures in the intelligence agencies to collect information and then make a decision based on a likely hypothesis. And it wasn't that they weren't collecting information. The lesson was that they had a lot of information, but they weren't using a process to analyze the information. So I think that's one of the challenges we face, where we have, some call it information overload. We have plenty of information and available data about risk, but the analytical process and the process of going through hypotheses generation, to me, seems to be possibly a gap. So making the analogy here, we use some type of an analytical process. This is one, the analysis of competing hypothesis, ACH. And you see the heading on the slide. It's used by analysts in various fields to make judgments that entail a high risk of error in reasoning. And I think that really encompasses quite a few of the risks that we deal with. They're novel. It might be a case where we've never seen this issue before, what some people call black swans or a wicked problem, these one-off events. And we can, in fact, increase our ability not to prevent these, but to better analyze the exposure and vulnerability. So this is, again, one part of the process. And the second part of the process, after we've gathered the data, is to try to make some sense of this. So ACH, that analysis of competing hypotheses, is then linked to sense-making, where we go into this process of saying we've got this data, we believe that there's a risk either embedded in the process or it's an external risk. It might be a gap, a perception gap by the community or one of our stakeholders. And what does this mean to the organization? And again, you're not developing a strategy here yet. You're just trying to figure out what's happening here. You're asking the question, what's the story? And in some cases, the analysis here is not driven by how accurate our story is. We might not have all the facts, and in most cases we won't have all the facts. It's driven by plausibility, as you see. And then it leads us to the question, so what do we do about this? And this is where the gaming process comes in. And so we've engaged both the behavioral threat teams and some of the leadership teams, specifically at UC Santa Cruz, in these games, where we develop an emerging story. We don't give the scenario and say, here's all of the events that happened and now you have to react. We ask, what would a worst case scenario or a most probable negative event look like here? And we develop the story with the people in the room, what we call the players. So that's the difference primarily between this process and the traditional scenario-driven functional tabletop or full-scale exercises that you see on the campuses. It's not to say that that process of doing the exercises is bad. It's to say that this augments that process. It allows for us to, again, create a scenario which is based on what people would answer to the question, what keeps you up at night? And so this, in the practice of doing this, you're actually forecasting. You're trying to think of vulnerabilities and process to reduce your exposure to this risk. And I realize, again, this might seem a bit abstract, so I'm going to bring this down to a little bit more detail and practical details. So this then leads to the conduct of a microgame, a short event, either 30 to 60 minutes. And traditionally, we've done this over a meal, so it could be a learn at lunch. This was kind of the structure that we used at, I mentioned UC Santa Cruz for their leadership. We walked through a behavioral threat event that ends in an act of violence as the scenario, and then the recovery to something like that. It was a scenario created largely by the people in the room, although we had some basic details as a backdrop. But then they discussed what would be your, what would keep you up at night about this, and then we went through that process. And so just to illustrate what the process looks like, we give the basic details of the risk. So in answer to the question, what keeps you up at night, the answer was, kind of in a Virginia Tech event or a repeat of the pepper spray incident at Davis or other events. That was kind of how the discussion starts. And then we brainstorm. So we're collecting the basic details. We're trying to clean up some of that data, but not make it so it's so formatic that there isn't room for free thinking. And then we're doing this brainstorming process. So we asked the group, so what would be some of the things that you would want to do now in order to reduce your vulnerability to this risk? And then you see we talk about challenges so that we realize there might be things that we talk about in brainstorming that we might not be able to do for a number of reasons. And so we talk about those challenges. So that isn't just a kind of a thought experiment. We do come down to what type of actions are we going to take. And we talk about the culture. Obviously, I mentioned UC Santa Cruz, but each campus obviously has its own culture. So this isn't to say that there's a solution that each organization will use and it's always going to be the same. The discussion at Santa Cruz will be demonstrably different than one that would possibly occur at another campus, I would believe. So they're going to pick moves. When it says moves, these are steps to reduce their vulnerability exposure to that risk. And then the last step in this process is to take some step, as it says select moves, it really is talking about steps, to mitigate those identified risks. So we're listing the risks that we'd like to reduce our liability to, our exposure to. This is really problem-based learning, so if you have experienced this before, it's really not, again, formatic as much as a tabletop or a functional or a full-scale exercise. It's more open-ended. So we encourage people to brainstorm, and we let them know that as much as they have plans and policies and procedures and emergency operations, and et cetera, to deal with these risks, this is a time for them to bring that in, but allow that there might be something outside of what we have in our plans, policies, and procedures that would work for this case. And we also talk about bias in the cycle. So our bias is traditionally that we have a plan and it's going to work, and I mentioned Dan Kleinman's work, the idea that we've already dealt with this. We have a plan based on the last event, and what we try to do is say that's fine, but is there any possibility that a future event might not mirror the last event? Are there variables in this process? And we try to work through those variables. Towards the end of this process, we try to guide it from thinking fast and slow, from the slow part of it where you have time in the decision process, to thinking fast, where we are trying to have fast and frugal. It's good enough, soon enough, communicated well enough to be understood, carried out well enough to work, so that they walk away with some thought about a decision cycle in the response phase. So it starts out with mitigation, and we move to response, and then end with recovery. And the recovery part really, I think, is where we have some good organizational learning, because we talk about the after effects and our exposure to some of this. And then we close with the plus delta, which is what did we learn as a result of this process, and what could be done different. And then what will you do as a result? In terms of rules, these aren't really hard and fast rules, but they're just some guidelines that we put down when we run through the exercise, the microgame. We want to focus on strategy. Obviously, there's a lot of what I'll call tactical detail in the plans that are already in place. They describe who will do what, when, and how. So we want to talk more in these events about what would be the impact to the reputation of the campus as a result of this, and how could we possibly be positioned better to deal with that reputational risk, or what would be the media strategy to respond to external criticism. And again, there's no offer that there's a solution to every one of the problems, which I think is sometimes a bit difficult to work through in one of these exercises, that we're not offering a solution. We're just opening the discussion and trying to help people to approach the problem in a more holistic way. And it says crises here. The goal is to improve the ability to prepare, respond, and recover from crises, because most of these events that we're talking about are, as I mentioned, these black swan events. They're something that would be a very novel case. And we've experienced those already, so some of you already have examples where it's a one-off event. We think that it's so difficult that we shouldn't, in fact, spend too much time on it. And I think that might be valid, but not spending any time is probably not a good idea either. So this is trying to balance that commitment of time and effort towards a real novel event. And this is really case-based learning. So again, I mentioned these could run parallel or ahead of what the campus is already doing, and it's really not to supplant anything or to suggest that the campus stop engaging in what they're already doing. I think there's a foundation there that's been supported by both the campus leadership and environment, health, and safety, and through their emergency services. So this isn't to disparage an effort that's already in place. It's to come alongside and to offer perhaps some support. What's difficult or different about this is that the facilitation role is not there to be an expert, not to stand in the place of those that are in the room. So when we did this, again, I'll just reference Santa Cruz. I was the facilitator, but the idea was to very quickly allow people to understand that was just to present the details, not to offer a solution from outside of the campus. And it might have been a bit different in that environment, because the struggling through the problem, I think, was new for some who were not familiar with the campus. We had off-campus resources, and they actually were party to the process of watching the campus leadership struggle through these issues, which I think is helpful, because they realized the gaps in our process, and now we're working to, or at least the campus is working to challenge out of those gaps. It's difficult to set this up with a large group. I offer this graphic here just to show that it's best to do this in a way that everyone can see each other. This is developed by UC San Diego School of Medicine, where they're teaching a lot of their coursework now for medical students in this problem-based learning environment. So this slide was developed by Charles Goldberg, who's the head of professional education at UCSD Medical School. And the idea is that we're trying to create a dialogue web, as it says. And again, I think in most cases, with a large exercise, this is really difficult to do. So the number of people that are engaged, anywhere beyond 20 or 30 people, and this gets really difficult to do. So you're trying to do this as a small group discussion at first, and then broaden it out. Again, this is Dr. Charles Goldberg. The graphic here, I realize it's simple, but I think his 9-year-old son put this slide together. But what it's trying to illustrate here is that when you do these exercises, traditionally, if we want to talk about an expectation gap, my experience, at least in emergency management and in doing exercises, was that we would find a problem and find a solution. So it would be a very linear process, as illustrated at the bottom here on the slide. We would discuss a problem and then talk about resolution, find a solution somewhere, and then move on. In these microgames, it's really more representative of the top of the slide, where it's, there are a lot of different discussions, and we're searching for available clues, and we still might not know for sure if we've solved the problem. We're going to continue to look for available clues, but we might at the end of the exercise say we haven't solved the issue of whether we could prevent a black swan event from occurring or not. So again, it is a different dynamic. We also talk about problem resolution and thinking about those issues that we've learned from the past that come up in most of these cases. If you're familiar with the top question here, this is really from Watergate and probably before that, just anticipating questions that will occur and trying to come up with some thoughts and possibly policy, although that might not happen in the room, but some thoughts on how would you address some of these questions that occur in almost all crises events. And the most often asked is, when did you know about this risk? What did you do about it? Why wasn't it prevented, etc. So again, this is just to guide the group through this discussion. And if you're in risk management, I think this process probably is not that alien. It might just be a different approach to what you're already doing with regard to searching for risks in the process. And then we ask open questions. So rather than saying, what does the plan say to do about this, which is a good question, we ask questions like, what does the scenario mean to the organization? This is that sense-making, trying to figure out what is the story here and how this event might be different from others and how that might change your approach. And if it's different, then is there a need to shift from the way that you've looked at these problems in the past to a new synthetic organizational structure, if you will? Not just the incident command system structure, but it might be small work groups that just focus on the risk issues embedded in the process. And traditionally this is called advanced planning, but it's hard to do in the breaking moments of a crisis. It's better put together before such an event occurs. And again, we then break into what's called the plusdelta. This is the beginning of the process where we ask, are there things that we've learned as a result of this experience? What were the most significant things that we experienced? Is there anything that we didn't cover? So for instance, kind of those burning issues that someone says, there's a problem here that we've just touched on, and really it's a principal issue for continued discussion. And has anything changed? So for instance, one of the things that we've asked in these training events for violence risk assessment is, what will you do differently? And often I've found in the discussion, the staff talk about doing a microgame for their staff, so taking the process and using it as a learn at lunch platform, which I think then advances the kind of the mission here that we're trying to accomplish, which is to get people to think creatively about risk management and vulnerability reduction. So if you're familiar with the plusdelta process, it gives everyone opportunity, rather than just concluding the thought experiment, if you will, and saying, hopefully you've had a chance to think more creatively. We really want to get down to what actions will you take. So the last bullet item here, 3 things you will do differently. The last event that we conducted was a Southern California violence risk assessment and management training last Friday. And one of the things that was mentioned as a result of gaming out a number of the scenarios was the need for faculty training on both violence risk assessment and classroom management. And I thought that was a really good learning as a result of the exercise. In coming, I realize this is we have an hour here, and I've gone through the slides. I had more information, but I'd rather spend more time in discussion if possible. It's really the kind of the idea here in doing these is to open it up for discussion. The idea is you're allowing people to look at these problems and spend time thinking about creative decision making and process improvement. And so hopefully, as I've illustrated here, the gaming process and the risk sensing process and the sense making process are helping those that we're trying to serve to think more creatively about risk management and to hopefully break down silos and bring in different groups into these discussions. So it's not just the risk managers, but it could be others who you might not think have a traditional role in this. And I'll mention the clinical environment. In the medical centers, the risk managers, I had a discussion with them last week, and they're thinking about bringing in the frontline staff into these discussions who face a high risk of violence against practitioners, especially nurses in the ERs. So, and there have just been 2 cases. Bob Charbonneau shared an email this morning where there's been violence against our medical staff. So it's definitely an area for us to help them in there. So that is the background information, and I wanted to open it up for questions and comments. And the idea would be to be able to share both the process with you, but also offer to assist you either in conducting microgames and risk sensing and sense making seminars, or in any way possible to just provide another tool in your toolkit. So that was really kind of the goal here, and I appreciate the opportunity to present this and wanted to open it up to see if there was any questions or further thoughts on the utility of this at your campus or in your environment. Oh, I see. Russ, you wrote, can give an example of what crisis we've microgamed. So in the case at Santa Cruz, we microgamed a student who was subject to a behavioral threat assessment who then engages in an act of violence on campus. And we gamed out largely the recovery process. And Esther Silver was in the room there and part of the game. And what we've essentially, and so were the chancellor and the leadership at Santa Cruz. What we gamed out was largely how would we respond to the scrutiny of the behavioral intervention process, the question of why didn't you prevent this from occurring. So it wasn't so much an exercise in response. In fact, we spent probably out of the 4 hours, maybe about 30 to 40 minutes on response. And the majority of our time we gamed out in how would the organization recover from external scrutiny about the process. And it was largely based on cases that have occurred at other campuses and how they've faced both internal and external scrutiny of their process. So that's one. The other that we've gamed with Southern and Northern California, not risk managers, but psychologists who are involved in violence risk assessment and those that are on the behavioral intervention teams. We gamed out strategies for dealing with those cases when it looks like there's going to be an act of violence, when there's a potential threat. So those are the 2 scenarios. I appreciate the question, Russ.
So how big a group have you done the games with? Are we talking 10 people, 5 people, 300 people? What's the kind of maximum size?
The probably the optimal size is about 30. When we did the exercise with the behavioral intervention teams, the Northern and Southern Cal teams, it was last week, Friday, for the Southern California teams. There's about 75, which is a lot of people to do a tabletop type event, microgame with. So we broke the room down into 7 tables of 10. And that, although it's more challenging logistically, the groups were able to work through 3 scenarios. At Santa Cruz, I think the room was about 40 people, and we set it up in a horseshoe so that we could still make it work. I think the optimal size, though, is probably no more than 30. And again, this can be done with staff as a learn at lunch on a specific risk, or you can open it up to this thought experiment where you ask them, what risk keeps you up at night?
Well, it sounds pretty exciting. What's the best way to try and sell this to campus management leadership so that we could we have a new Vice Chancellor of Finance. We'll have a new Vice Chancellor of Business Administrative Services. We have a relatively new Chancellor, and I think it'd be a great opportunity for them to get their feet wet in doing crisis management at UC. And I guess I need to develop some sort of a sales pitch to be able to deliver it to them and say, here's something that's available to us, here's the time frame it's going to take, here are the resources, and see if I can get them on board. Do you have any suggestions for me?
Yeah, I think probably the way you phrase it, that it's a good way to get your feet wet, and it's it's a no-fault environment, so there's no external evaluation. It's not set up for that. The time commitment is really open. We've done these in as kind of short a time as 2 hours, and when you have a group that really wants to explore a detailed scenario, it could grow into more time. For instance, with Santa Cruz, we spent 4 hours, but they knew exactly what they wanted to focus on, so it was more of a focused event. In an open-ended event, 2 hours is fine just to start, as you said, kind of get your feet wet with crisis management. The other is that there's no cost to the campus, for me to come out and help or to facilitate a microgame. So that might help to reduce any kind of apprehension. I don't know, Russ, if that goes to your question.
Sure. I think you gave me some ideas on how I can phrase it involved.
Hey, Russ. This is Cheryl Lloyd. I have a suggestion.
Okay.
I was going to suggest that you may talk to Santa Cruz and see what they use to pitch it to their senior leadership. That's
a good idea. Who did you work through at Santa Cruz?
It was Jean Marie.
Okay.
And also the chief of police, and Esther assisted.
Not Esther, Rosemary.
Yeah.
Esther's
I'm
at
sorry.
UCSF.
Oh, thank you so much. Sorry.
I'm Esther.
Thanks,
I would
Esther.
love to take credit for that, but
yeah. Sorry. So
Rosemary Anderson.
Right. Thanks, Esther.
No worries. I would love to have you do something like that here too, but it was Rosemary.
Right. I see Saladin's also on the webinar, and he was party to this too, and so he might be able to speak to the experience.
Philip, I think I was actually on vacation when you had the big group down here, so I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to make any comment on it, though. I did have a question that perhaps you could speak a little bit about packaging the learnings or the conclusions of one of these workshops on a particular scenario. In other words, what a campus might expect to have as a tangible takeaway for the time invested, which might encourage them to say, wow, that's pretty cool. Let's do it again with another scenario, or another situation, and with the idea that they might eventually build kind of a body or a book of some of the thinking that happened when they weren't under the heat of the moment.
Yeah, that's really a good way to say it too. So we did this. I'm sorry, Saladin. I don't know why I forgot that you weren't there. But we did this, the plusdelta, where we asked the question, and you see the slide hopefully. And in the area of, and I should say that we wanted to start out with pluses because it seems like quite a few of the exercises that are conducted, at least in my experience, focus on, in a way, for a lot of good reasons, the negative. What didn't we do, or what didn't we do well? And so we did capture that, and I provided that back to the campus. There was some work to take the information and bring it back in terms of action items, not as a after-action report, but more of here are the areas that we'd like to investigate more. And so I think if you go back and you talk to Nader there at Santa Cruz, he'll be able to show you what was generated. It was essentially what you said, though. Here, we'd like to develop some more focus in this area, and Jean Marie also has some of that information as well.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. I should say, I think, ending with, what did we do well, it in a way seems like it ought to be intuitive, but again, some of the exercises seem to end with this, what were all the mistakes we made? So we wanted to reinforce this is not this is a no-fault event. This allows us to think about this, and not just to be self-congratulatory, but to say, we did in fact do some risk mitigation today, just merely by spending time together, breaking down some silos, talking about approach. This is in fact mitigation and vulnerability reduction when you invest in the process.
Philip, we've got a question in the chat box. One is, are there scenarios that are more critical or common to most campuses that you would recommend focusing on?
I don't know whether this is representative or not of more critical or common, but the ones that I've been asked to facilitate more often deal with some behavioral issue that ends in an act of violence. That might be an artifact of the fact that I'm working in that, so it's kind of natural selection in a way, where because people know that that's the area you're working, they ask for that. But that seems to be foremost on the minds of at least campus leadership. The ones that I've talked to, the chancellors that I've talked to, and at UC Santa Cruz, when I talked to the chancellor, his remark was, I am really concerned about one of these events where we're worried and there might not be a lot we can do, and then there's this awful event. And it's not to game out, the process that they're working in. They were already dealing with the mitigation. It's to talk about how they would recover and how they would focus their energies on getting back to instruction. So that seems to be a common scenario right now. Not focusing so much on the response, but the recovery. And that might be an indication that a lot of times we don't get or we don't spend time on thinking about recovery. So, Richard, I think that was your question, and I hopefully answered it.
And then one more question in the chat box. Can you address how geographically dispersed groups can carry out gaming virtually?
Yeah, I have done some games in a format like Ready Talk. I think one of the things that probably everyone would acknowledge is you lose a lot of that human interaction, obviously. Doing the game itself and the whole idea of problem-based learning, which really is based on kind of the case-based or Socratic learning. Part of the benefit to doing this is breaking down barriers to communication and being in the room with the other people that you're working with. And yeah, it can be done online, but I think the benefit of having this discussion, one of the takeaways, is that you have broken down some barriers. And you are, working towards making more contact with people that you otherwise might not see, and talking about a problem that's difficult to discuss. I'm not suggesting that it cannot be done online. We could have run through a scenario today and probably engaged in a discussion. But I will tell you, my experience has been that there's a lot more interaction and nonverbal communication cues, etc., obviously, that you're going to pick up by doing this in close proximity to those that are engaged. So it can be done online and it can be done virtually. I think the value of doing this in a small group setting speaks for itself.
All right. Do we have any further questions? The lines are still open. But if not, I think we will wrap this up by thanking Philip. Thank you very much, Philip. Appreciate it.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity.
The recording will be posted shortly, and we look forward to seeing you at future ERM Toolbox webinars. Thank you.